Faso, where the military government has reached a new level of confrontation by arresting 8 staff members of the international NGO safety organization, INSO, on grave charges of spying and treason. Now, Security Minister Mahamudu Sana accuses them of collecting sensitive military information. INSO forcefully rejects this, claiming that their work is only for the safety of aid workers.
The sun had not yet risen over Ouagadougou when the convoys began to move. Engines growled low, disciplined, almost respectful of the sleeping city. Armored vehicles rolled through empty streets washed in pale blue dawn, their headlights cutting through dust and silence. Soldiers in unmarked uniforms stepped down with precision, boots hitting the ground in unison. Radios crackled once, then went quiet. Somewhere, a gate creaked open. Somewhere else, a door was knocked, not loudly, not violently, but with the finality of authority that expected obedience. Inside 8 different compounds, all registered under the same humanitarian banner, the same thing happened within minutes. Phones were confiscated, laptops sealed, passports removed from bedside tables. Men and women who had arrived in Burkina Faso under the promise of aid, development, and partnership were escorted into vehicles without resistance, their faces caught between disbelief and calculation. No cameras, no press, no explanations beyond a single sentence spoken calmly, repeatedly. For reasons of national security, you are being detained. As the convoys disappeared back into the city's arteries, Burkina Faso's borders quietly shifted. Airspace restrictions were issued under technical language. Internet speed slowed, just enough to be felt. Embassies woke to unanswered calls. Flags fluttered over silent buildings where lights remained off long past sunrise. By mid-morning, the rumor was already alive. By noon, it had a name: an NGO spy scandal. And by nightfall, the shockwaves had begun to travel far beyond Burkina Faso's red earth, rippling across a continent that had seen this story before, only never quite like this. In the capital, state television interrupted its regular programming with a single image, the national emblem, steady and unblinking, accompanied by a measured voice. The spokesperson did not shout. There was no drama in the delivery, no triumph, only certainty. Following a comprehensive counterintelligence operation, Burkina Faso has detained 8 foreign nationals operating under the cover of a non-governmental organization. Evidence suggests activities incompatible with their declared humanitarian mission. Investigations are ongoing. National sovereignty will be defended. That was all. No names, no countries, no photographs. The restraint was deliberate, and it unsettled everyone. Across Ouagadougou, cafes filled with whispers. On motorbikes and buses, people leaned closer, lowering their voices while their eyes burned with curiosity and something else, recognition. For decades, aid organizations had come and gone, some sincere, some opaque, all powerful in ways that rarely felt accountable. Clinics were built, wells were dug, workshops were held, but so too were reports written, data collected, networks mapped. Now, for the first time, the curtain appeared to be lifting. In a secure building far from the city center, a group of senior officers sat around a table illuminated by a single overhead light. Maps of the Sahel glowed on the walls. Screens displayed lines of intercepted communications, color-coded and time-stamped. What lay before them was not a sudden discovery, but the end of a long, patient watch. For months, signals analysts had flagged irregular transmissions, encrypted bursts sent at odd hours, routed through servers thousands of kilometers away. Field officers noticed patterns: aid convoys detouring without explanation, meetings held off-record, local staff quietly replaced by foreign specialists whose resumes did not quite match their assignments. Satellite imagery revealed equipment that did not belong in a health outreach mission. The NGO in question had an impeccable public image. Annual reports spoke of resilience, empowerment, transparency. Their logo was familiar across West Africa. Their funding came from respected institutions, layered through foundations and development agencies until the trail blurred. But behind the clinics and community centers, another architecture had been forming. Data was being gathered, not just on water access or nutrition, but on troop movements, local leadership dynamics, public sentiment toward the government. Names of activists, names of officers, names of those who might resist, or comply, or fracture under pressure. Information is power, and power, once mapped, can be manipulated. When the evidence reached a tipping point, the decision was made quietly, decisively. There would be no partial measures, no warnings, no negotiated exits. At dawn, the state would act. In Europe, the day began with confusion. Foreign ministries received fragmentary reports from embassies that could not reach their nationals. A routine consular inquiry escalated into emergency meetings. By afternoon, headlines had hardened, stripped of nuance and filled with alarmist language. Aid workers detained. Humanitarian crisis looms. Unprecedented arrests raise concerns. Television panels filled with experts who spoke quickly, confidently, and often without context. Words like authoritarian drift and military overreach surfaced early, as if pre-written. The detained individuals were described exclusively as volunteers, professionals, innocents caught in political theater. No one asked what they were doing awake at 2 a.m., transmitting encrypted packets to offshore nodes. No one asked why their NGO's internal memos referenced military-grade risk assessments. Instead, the narrative was set. A fragile African state had overreacted. Inside Burkina Faso, the reaction was different. Crowds gathered around radios and phones. Social media, though throttled, buzzed with fragments, screenshots, voice notes, unverified leaks. Some were exaggerated, others chillingly precise. A sense of vindication crept into conversations. So it was true, people said. They were watching us. Veterans remembered earlier eras when foreign advisors seemed to know too much. Students recalled workshops where questions drifted from development to dissent. Farmers spoke of surveys that never led to projects, only reports. This time, the state had drawn a line. Across Africa, capitals took notice. In Accra, Abuja, Nairobi, Addis Ababa, closed-door meetings were convened. Intelligence chiefs compared notes they had never before shared so openly. Similar patterns emerged: NGOs with dual funding streams, overlapping personnel, shadow partnerships with private contractors. What Burkina Faso had done was not just an arrest. It was a precedent. Regional bodies issued carefully worded statements, calling for dialogue, transparency, and respect for sovereignty. Between the lines, a deeper debate raged. Should Africa close ranks or keep its distance? Should this moment be seized or smoothed over before it grew dangerous? In one coastal capital, a senior diplomat stared out at the ocean while an aide briefed him in hushed tones. If they release the evidence, the aide said, it won't just embarrass a few organizations. It could expose an entire system. The diplomat nodded slowly. Systems, once exposed, do not forgive. Back in Ouagadougou, the detainees were held separately, in clean, unmarked facilities. Interrogations were methodical, professional. No raised voices. No theatrics. Just questions, followed by silence long enough to invite mistakes. Some held their composure. Others faltered. One admitted to forwarding situational updates beyond the scope of humanitarian work. Another claimed ignorance, insisting they were compartmentalized, only later to contradict themselves when confronted with logs and timestamps. The picture grew clearer and darker. This was not espionage in the old sense of trench coats and dead drops. This was modern intelligence, outsourced, deniable, embedded within goodwill. It thrived on plausibility, on the moral shield of aid. And Burkina Faso had pierced that shield. European capitals scrambled. Diplomatic cables flew. Trade implications were raised. Aid suspensions were whispered, then denied, then reconsidered. Pressure mounted quietly, then less so. Behind closed doors, threats were softened into concerns, incentives into cooperation. But the Burkinabe leadership held steady. A statement was released to regional partners, firm and measured. Africa has welcomed assistance for decades, but assistance cannot become surveillance. Partnership cannot mean penetration. Our sovereignty is not negotiable. The words traveled fast. On the streets of Dakar and Bamako, young people shared the clip with clenched fists and quiet pride. In university halls, debates reignited about neo-colonialism's modern face. In the diaspora, talk shows ran long into the night, callers arguing fiercely about whether this was courage or catastrophe. Was Burkina Faso risking isolation, or was it lighting a fuse long overdue? International media intensified its focus. Anonymous sources leaked selective details, often framing the arrests as politically motivated. Think pieces warned of chilling effects on aid delivery. Few addressed the core allegation directly. Fewer still asked why intelligence agencies had grown so comfortable outsourcing influence through humanitarian fronts. Inside Africa, alternative narratives flourished. Independent journalists began connecting dots long ignored. Old contracts resurfaced. Former NGO staff spoke anonymously about internal contradictions, about pressure to collect extra data, about meetings that felt less like aid planning and more like strategic analysis. The continent watched itself think in real time. In Addis Ababa, a veteran Pan-African scholar addressed a packed auditorium. His voice trembled not with anger, but with gravity. For 50 years, he said, we have debated sovereignty in theory. Today, it confronts us in practice. The question is not whether Burkina Faso is right or wrong. The question is whether Africa is ready. Ready to audit those who claim to help. Ready to say no to funding with strings woven invisibly into its fabric. Ready to accept the consequences of independence not just in flags and anthems, but in data, narratives, and power. Behind the scenes, the investigation continued. One recovered hard drive revealed geospatial mapping far beyond humanitarian needs. Another contained correspondence with a private intelligence firm whose name did not appear in any NGO disclosure. Financial records traced money through layers designed to obscure origin and intent. Each revelation tightened the silence around certain embassies. At the same time, Burkina Faso made a calculated choice, not to release everything at once. Information, like power, is most effective when paced. A partial briefing was shared with select African governments. Enough to alarm, enough to persuade, not enough to provoke panic. Trust, long fractured, began to knit in unexpected places. A regional intelligence cooperation framework, dormant for years, was quietly reactivated. Europe responded with urgency masked as restraint. Envoys were dispatched. Language softened. Offers of joint investigations emerged. Offers that would have seemed reasonable weeks earlier now felt intrusive. The detainees remained in custody. Days turned into weeks. And then, one evening, as the Sahel sky burned orange, a single question echoed across talk shows and timelines alike. If this could happen in Burkina Faso, where else had it already happened without anyone noticing? The continent held its breath. Some feared retaliation, economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, destabilization dressed up as concern. Others sensed momentum, a rare alignment of public sentiment and state action. Africa had been spoken about for generations. Now, it was speaking back. The story did not end with a dramatic release or a televised trial. It did not resolve neatly. That was the point. Because power rarely reveals itself in climaxes. It shifts in subtleties, in who sets the terms, who asks the questions, who dares to enforce answers. As night fell again over Ouagadougou, the city hummed with a quiet, electric awareness. Something had changed, not just in policy, but in posture. A small nation had said, "We are watching the watchers." And across Africa, millions wondered, not without unease, not without hope, whether this moment marked the beginning of a new chapter or the opening line of a far more dangerous story still being written.